I've got my book copy, but I didn't have it with me over the last week. So I had to print out a PDF version of it. So I'll point you to the beginning, and then we'll just kind of go through paragraph by paragraph. But we're going to be skipping a lot of paragraphs. I don't think we'll be here the full 3 hours tonight. Okay. Start at the beginning. I don't know if your version has a footnote at the beginning. I don't remember if this one does.
No, it has endnotes, but no footnotes.
That tells you the essay was originally given or produced, printed in 1936. It was first delivered as a live lecture by Tolkien. And I think I've mentioned before, prior to this, when people read Beowulf, and Tolkien goes into this some, when people read Beowulf, they read it not as a piece of literature, as a work of literature, but as a source of material to discover information about pagan Germanic society or the Germanic culture and mores and things like that. So what Tolkien starts to do at the beginning is he discusses some of that previous approach to Beowulf. Now, I'm going to skip the first paragraph. Go on to the second paragraph, and he uses the word Beowulfiana. Okay, that term, you throw it in IANA, and it means kind of the industry around. You have Tolkieniana today, you've got Lewisiana today, you've got Rowlingiana essentially today. So he's talking about Beowulfiana. And he says, I think to venture the opinion that Beowulfiana is, while rich in many departments, especially poor in one. That is, while the industry of the study of Beowulf is rich in many ways, he says it's poor in one. It is poor in criticism. Criticism that is directed to the understanding of a poem as a poem. So he narrows down what he means there by criticism. He's not saying Beowulfiana is deficient in literary criticism, because it hadn't been. I mean, there had been an awful lot of stuff written about Beowulf, but it hadn't been written about Beowulf as a poem. So he says Beowulf has been used, last sentence of that paragraph, Beowulf has been used as a quarry of fact and fancy far more assiduously than it has been studied as a work of art. Now notice what he says there, a quarry of fact and fancy. Fancy there means fantasy, made up, assertions and such. So he says people have dug into it and have gotten nuggets of fact. He likes death, for example, is a fact. And then all kinds of fancies, all kinds of fanciful ideas based upon it. So, he says, it is of Beowulf then as a poem that I wish to speak. Not as a historical piece of evidence, not as a way to understand the Germanic mindset, not as an ethnographic study of a society, etc., as a poem. Okay? So, skipping the next two paragraphs, actually in the one where he gives the first little allegory, okay? And he mentions all, the sisters, philologia, mythologia, archaeologia, leographia, etc. He goes on, he says, of all these, Poesis was always left out. Why? The Beowulf, they said, the they here is the critics. The Beowulf, they said, is hardly an affair of yours, and not in any case a protege that you could be proud of. That is, they said, these other sisters, the archaeologists, the philologists, the mythologists, they said, Beowulf is not a product of yours, Poesis. It's not a product of poetry. It's an historical document. Only as such does it interest the superior culture of today. Okay? Now, when Tolkien addresses this topic to this group, he's not necessarily speaking to the choir. Okay? This is not a group that is necessarily going to jump behind in total agreement with him. And it is an historical document that it has mainly been examined and dissected. People have gone through it, with a fine-tooth comb, pulling out names, then trying to link those names with other characters in Germanic mythology and Germanic stories to try to determine whether they're real or mythological or merely fictional, etc. Okay? And he quotes a professor who talks about Beowulf and says Beowulf is an important historical document. Notice he says nothing in the little quote that Tolkien gives of him, Professor Strong, nothing about it being poetry or literature. So, Tolkien goes on and says, I make this point why? Because it seems to me that the air has been clouded not only for Strong, the professor made the previous point, but for other authoritative critics. Because what do they all say about Beowulf? And he gives us a, it's not this passage, I thought it was this passage. He's going to give us in a few pages kind of a listing of what people have said Beowulf is and is not. So, why should we approach this, or indeed any other poem, mainly as an historical document? Tolkien says that is a defensible point. That is, it is okay to approach something as an historical document.
Yeah, the paragraph you're thinking of is the one that starts on page 8.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, firstly, if one is not concerned with poetry at all, but seeking information wherever it may be found, that's why you could approach a work of poetry as an historical document. Secondly, if the so-called poem contains a fact of poetry, then you can look at it for something else. But Tolkien says, I'm not concerned with the first. Why? Because that's the job of the historian. The historian's search is, of course, perfectly legitimate. That's fine. But skip down to about the middle of that paragraph, right after he mentions Helak. He says, it is indeed a curious fact that it is one of the peculiar poetic virtues of Beowulf that has contributed to its own critical misfortunes. And what he means by that is the poet behind Beowulf was so successful at writing the poem the way he intended to write the poem. He was so successful that his readers have mistook it as being history and not poetry. The Beowulf, the illusion of historical truth and perspective that has made Beowulf seem such an attractive quarry is largely a product of art. What does Tolkien mean by that? It's fiction. Okay? He's saying the writer of Beowulf intended to give off that impression that what you were reading was history. Nearly all the censure, next paragraph, and most of the praise that has been bestowed on the Beowulf has been due either to the belief that it was something that it was not, for example, primitive, that is, that it was primitive, that it was pagan, that it was Teutonic, that it was an allegory, or most often that it's an epic. Or, okay, the censure and the praise that has been bestowed has been because, or the disappointment at the discovery that it was itself and not something that the scholar would have liked better. For example, a heathen heroic lay. What Tolkien is saying here is that some critics have approached Beowulf and they've censured it because of what it is not. Okay? Rather than dealing with the poem that they have, they deal with the poem they wish they had in its stead. Or they deal with the information that they wish the poem told them instead. There's been a ton of stuff about why doesn't the Beowulf poet tell tell us more about Beowulf's youth. Hrothgar says early in the poem, stories have come to me from the land of the gates about Beowulf and his strength, that he has the strength of 30 men in his hand grip, and how he has fought monsters, etc. What that tells us is that within the world of the poem, stories of Beowulf have already circulated in the Germanic world. Okay? Long before he kills Grendel. We have no idea of his age at this point. Okay? So some critics are like, so why don't we know more? Where are those other stories? Why didn't the poet tell us that? Okay. It's sheer speculation. We can't even presume to formulate an answer to that kind of question. Right?
There's lots of things you can suggest for that. Like maybe there were other poems circulating that had those stories
exactly
in them. Like for all we know, like it's just considering the state in which this one comes to us, those. I mean, can you expect that everything is gone?
I think a more relevant question is, why are there no other tales surviving about Beowulf? This is the only one. It's the only tale in Old English or any other Germanic languages that have this hero. It's the only text that has this name. Period. Nowhere else does the name Beowulf show up.
And we only have this one by the skin of our teeth.
Yeah, and we only have this. I mean, we know Hrothgar from other tales. We know Helac from other tales. We know Weston from other tales. We know Hrothulf from other tales. Okay, the Geats we know from other tales. This is the only one we have about Beowulf. So it goes on. For example, that it's not a heroic lay, or a history of Sweden, or a manual of Germanic antiquities, or a Nordic Summa Theologica. And so now he gives us another allegory. Okay? And remember from the fairy story essay, he says that he dislikes allegory. And you'll see when we start Lord of the Rings next week, in the introduction to the Lord of the Rings, or the foreword, he says, I cordially dislike allegory and have done so ever since I was old enough to know the difference between it and applicability. Meaning, since he was probably in his early teens. Okay? So, a man inherited a field in which was an accumulation of old stone, part of an older hall. Of the old stone, some had already been used in building the house in which he actually lived, not far from the old house of his fathers. Of the rest, he took some and built a tower. But his friends coming perceived at once that the stones had formerly belonged to a more ancient building. So what do? They pushed the tower over, with no little labor, in order to look for hidden carvings and inscriptions, to discover whence the man's distant forefathers had obtained their building material. Some, suspecting a deposit of coal under the soil, began to dig for it and forgot even the stones. They all said, this tower is most interesting, but they also said, what a muddle it is in, after pushing it over. Okay. How does the allegory work? What's the tower?
The poem.
It's the poem. Okay. Notice what the poem is made of. Old stones. Well, what are the old stones? They're the old elements of Germanic myth, story, and legend that this particular poet weaves into this particular tale. So what are modern critics doing? They're tearing the tale apart to see what it's made out of. Remember in the fairy story essay what Tolkien says about the cauldron of story, and how you can't take the story apart to discover what it means. Gandalf will say, we'll do this next week when we do Fellowship of the Ring. Gandalf will say to Saruman in Fellowship of the Ring, when Saruman makes a comment about white light and the white page, he says, the white light can be broken, the white page can be written on. And Gandalf says, in which case and then he goes on and says, the white light can be broken. Gandalf says, in which case it is no longer white. And he who would destroy a thing to discover what it is has left the path of wisdom. Now, I think that's Tolkien, the literary critic, coming out and saying someone who would take a poem apart to try to find out what it is doesn't know what a poem is. You don't take it apart to find out what it is or how it works. So, he says, I hope I shall show, the next paragraph, that allegory is just. And notice, by the way, how he finished the allegory. They said the guy who built the tower was kind of an oddball. Such an odd fellow. Imagine he's using these old stones just to build a nonsensical tower. Why did he not restore the old house? He had no sense of proportion. But from the top of that tower, the man had been able to look out upon the sea. That is, he built the tower for a purpose. They couldn't understand the purpose. So, here's where Tolkien goes on and says, this is what people have said about Beowulf. Beowulf is a half-baked native epic, the development of which was killed by Latin learning. It was inspired by emulation of Virgil, and is a product of the education that came in with Christianity. It is feeble and incompetent as a narrative. The rules of narrative are cleverly observed in the manner of the learned epic. It is the confused product of a committee of muddle-headed and probably beer-bemused Anglo-Saxons. This is a Gallic voice, meaning a Frenchman. It is a string of pagan lays edited by monks. It is the work of a learned but inaccurate Christian antiquarian. It is a work of genius, rare and surprising. Go ahead.
Actually kind of thought it was funny how he used the word Gallic here, because, of course, at that time, the French people were all very, refined in the views of a lot of people, but in fact, he uses Gallic, and so they're, called.
Well, what do you mean? What do you mean in that time period? In the time when he's saying this,
Yeah.
or when the time when the poem is written?
No. I mean,
Okay.
at the time when he's saying this. And so he's using the word Gallic here, which I think is funny because, that recalls the barbaric past
The older,
of the French.
So he says, he goes on, though the genius seems to have been shown principally in doing something much better left undone. This is a very recent voice. Okay, that's to the person who says it's a work of genius. Now, it is a wild folk tale. General chorus means lots of people have said this. It is a poem of an aristocratic and courtly tradition. Same voices. Notice, how can it be a wild folk tale and, by the same voices, a poem of an aristocratic and courtly tradition? It can't be. It's a hodgepodge. It is a sociological, anthropological, archaeological document. It is a mythical allegory. Very old voices these, and generally shouted down, but not so far out as some of the newer cries. And what Tolkien means, though, they're not so far off the mark as some of the newer voices. It is rude and rough. It is a masterpiece of metrical art. It has no shape at all. It is singularly weak in construction. It's a clever allegory of contemporary politics. Its architecture is solid. It is thin and cheap. It is undeniably weighty. It is a national epic. It is a translation from the Danish. It was imported by Frisian raiders. It is a burden to English syllabuses. In other words, why in the world do we have to read it? And lastly, it is worth studying. And he says, everybody says that. Even those who say it has no shape at all, it is rude and rough, it is a wild folktale, it has no ordering principle, etc. So, Tolkien says, it's not surprising that it should now be felt that a view, a decision, a conviction are imperatively needed. So, he says some paths have opened in the wood, and he has a fairly lengthy kind of allusion to Lewis Carroll and the Jabberwock. Nonetheless, paths of a sort have been opened in the wood. Slowly, with the rolling years, the obvious, so often the last revelation of analytic study, meaning so often these analytic critics do what? They don't go for the simplest and clearest thing.
Don't see the tower for the stones.
Yeah, they don't see the tower for the stones. What do? They go for the most esoteric, the most arcane. The obvious has been discovered. that we have to deal with a poem by an Englishman using afresh ancient and largely traditional material. That's what Beowulf is. It is a poem by an Englishman using, in a new way, ancient and traditional material. Okay? We might also now again inquire, skipping a couple lines, what the poet did with it. That is, what he did with that ancient and traditional material. And the first person he lists by name, other than that Archibald Strong, is W.P. Kerr. Kerr was a major Anglo-Saxon critic in the early 20th century. Really huge. So when Tolkien specifies him and praises him and then kind of gently, puts the knife in between the ribs and twists it to say, but he was wrong. There's a reason why he does that gently. He says, Kerr, and then skipping several lines, in approaching Beowulf was hampered by the almost inevitable weakness of his, Kerr's, greatness. Well, what does he mean? Stories and plots must sometimes have seemed triter to him, the much read, than they did to the old poets and their audiences. And he goes on and explains why. Because the old poets and their audiences probably didn't know as much as Kerr did. That is, they might have known the story of Beowulf, but they probably weren't familiar with all the other stories, or they may not have been, as familiar with all the other stories that Kerr had in his mind. Okay? Possibly that's true. Many critics think that the Beowulf poet is so elusive because he knows. He mentions a name and the audience picks up on its meaning, its relationship. So that in a class today, if a professor mentions Benedict Arnold, most American students understand the allusion. A foreign student from Saudi Arabia, wouldn't catch that. Okay? So, he quotes Kerr and says, where Kerr says, the fault of Beowulf is that there's nothing much in the story. Beowulf has nothing else to do, that is, other than kill monsters. He has nothing else to do when he's killed Grendel and Grendel's mother in Denmark. He goes on to his own Goutland until at last the rolling years bring the fire drake and his last adventure. It's too simple. Yet the three chief episodes are well wrought and well diversified. They're not repetitions. Skipping a few more lines, the great beauty, the real value of Beowulf is in its dignity of style. But notice what Kerr is saying. What the Beowulf poet does is says nothing beautifully. That's what he's saying. It has this fantastic style, but it's a style about nothing really of import. In construction, it is curiously weak, in a sense preposterous. For while the main story is simplicity itself, the merest commonplace of heroic legend, that is, you have a guy and he kills monsters. Big deal. All about it, in the historic allusions, there are revelations of a whole world of tragedy, plots different in import from that of Beowulf, more like the tragic themes of Iceland. Notice what he's saying there. The story is actually only about Beowulf and his fights with the dragons. All these other things are relatively of more importance, and yet they're only alluded to. Yet with this radical defect, a disproportion that puts the irrelevances in the center, Grendel's mother, the dragon, and the serious things on the outer edges, the fights, the wars with the Swedes, the wars with the Heathobards, the wars with the Frisians, the interfamily conflict with Hrothulfin, Hrothgar and ENGL and Hrothgar, etc. He says, even with this, the poem of Beowulf is undeniably weighty. So Tolkien says, okay, now that was written 30 years ago. Its primary effect, that is, the effect of what Kerr says, is to state a paradox, which one feels has always strained the belief, even of those who accepted it, and has given to Beowulf the character of an enigmatic poem. How could this poet write with such great depth of feeling and great dignity of style about something so trite? So, he then goes on and quotes R.W. Chambers in his little book on Widsith, where Widsith talks about Beowulf and quotes Kerr and says something about the Beowulf poet kind of screwed up because why? For in this conflict between plighted troth and the duty of revenge, we have a situation which the old heroic poets loved and would not have sold for a wilderness of dragons. He's saying that the Beowulf poet thought of a dragon and thought, oh, I've got to have a dragon in the story. Okay? And Chambers exaggerates by saying there's a wilderness of dragons, which Tolkien's going to point out.
I mean, not to make Tolkien's point for him, but it's just like Tolkien does an excellent job of like building up this frustration where these people are constantly talking about like, oh man, all the stuff he's alluding to would have been so much better than Beowulf, and it's like, but then it wouldn't be Beowulf.
Yeah.
It would be a story about somebody else.
Exactly.
So what's the point of even saying that?
Exactly. It would be, the tale of Frodo or the tale of Helak or something like that. So, skip that next paragraph and Tolkien says, as for the poem, one dragon, however hot, does not make a summer or a host. And a man might well exchange for one good dragon that what he would not sell for a wilderness. That is, don't overestimate what the value of one good dragon can do to a story. But he says, but that doesn't make a wilderness. In Northern literature, there are only 2 dragons that are significant. They're both mentioned in Beowulf. One is the dragon in Beowulf. The other is the dragon alluded to in Beowulf. Okay? Fafnir, the dragon that Sigismund kills. Okay? But this is not a wilderness of dragons. The allusion to the more renowned worm killed by the whale-sing is sufficient indication that the poet selected a dragon of well-founded purpose, or saw its significance in the plot as it had reached him. Even as he was careful to compare his hero to the prince of the heroes of the north. He esteemed dragons. That is, the poet didn't just settle on any dragon. He picked the only other named dragon in Germanic literature. He esteemed dragons as rare as they are dire, as some do still. He liked them as a poet, not as a zoologist. He didn't describe the dragon in frighteningly realistic detail. Okay? He wasn't concerned about the anatomy or the physiology of dragons. He was concerned about the effect that dragons have on people. So, Tolkien goes on. We see this kind of criticism again in Chambers' Beowulf in the Heroic Age. We are told again that the main story of Beowulf is a wild folk tale. Chambers says the folk tale is a good servant, but a bad master. It has been allowed in Beowulf to usurp the place of honor and to drive into episodes and digressions the things which should be the main stuff of a well-conducted epic. In other words, Chambers is saying Beowulf ought to be an epic. That it isn't an epic is not what he wants to write about. Okay? That is, he doesn't want to write about the poem as it is. He wants to write about what the poem as it should have been, what the poet should have done. And he uses that phrase, digressions and episodes, which then becomes used repeatedly in Beowulf criticism. The episodes and digressions. They're different things. Episodes are little short snippets of stories, and digressions are slightly longer. Okay? So you have the Finnsburg digression, where the poet takes us off, and we go off to the land of Finn and the Frisians, and we see a battle and the stuff there, and it's fairly long within the poem. It's over 100 lines, or almost 100 lines. Then you have these little episodes, little 5, 10 line, usually not much longer than that, kind of rabbit trails where the poet says, oh look, a Germanic allusion, and, goes and chases it. Okay? What Chambers and others are saying is that these things ought to be the center of the poem. These elements of Germanic history or mythology ought to be at the center. And the Grindelkin and the dragon ought to be roaming around the outside. But the poet didn't do that. The poet made these very secondary and made the monster central. And that's Tolkien's point. There's a reason why the monsters are central and these things are secondary. That these are secondary is part of the technique of the poem. Okay? So, Tolkien says, go to the end of that paragraph and go to the next one. Higher praise then is found in the learned critics whose scholarship enables them to appreciate these things. Notice the little dig there at critics. Okay? Higher praise then is found in the learned critics whose scholarship enables them to appreciate these things. That is, their wonderful knowledge about all things Beowulf, which those of us who don't have the scholarship therefore can't understand, could hardly be given to the detail, the tone, the style, and indeed to the total effect of Beowulf. That is, the learned critics praise the detail, the tone, the style, and the total effect of Beowulf. Yet this poetic talent, we are to understand, has all been squandered on an unprofitable theme. Why would a poet of such ability write on such a horrible theme? It would be like Shakespeare writing an episode of, yeah, pick some crappy TV show.
Or
You know,
like, I don't know, that little
Seinfeld.
or one of the episodes in Geoffrey of Monmouth's History of the Kings of Britain. Like, imagine Shakespeare writing on something like that.
Well, he does do that,
Yes, I know. That was the joke.
But that doesn't fit what he's suggesting here. Shakespeare does take elements, for example, of Geoffrey, and does what? Transforms them. Okay? He turns Lear from a mere mythological story into one of the greatest tragedies of the English language. The Beowulf poet, who is an equivalent of Shakespeare, writes, essentially an episode of Seinfeld out of that ability. Doesn't usually happen. Okay? So, the high tone, the sense of dignity alone is evidence in Beowulf of the presence of a mind lofty and thoughtful. In other words, Tolkien's approaching this and saying to his audience, if you guys think there's a problem in Beowulf with the theme, and yet you think that the style is dignified and high and mighty, and the tone is somber and weighty, and you have all this other praise, isn't there a jarring disconnect there? Shouldn't you maybe reapproach the poem and say, okay, if it does have this high tone, and if it does have this sense of dignity, then doesn't that tell us something about the mind behind it? Isn't it also lofty and thoughtful? If it is, or if you accept that it is, then maybe what we need to do is we need to find a way to approach the poem to find that loftiness and thoughtfulness. Okay? It is, one would have said, improbable that such a man would write more than 3,000 lines on matter that is really not worth serious attention. And people have written much longer poems in English literature that nobody reads today because they're almost unreadable. A guy in the Middle Ages named Orm wrote a really long poem called The Ormulum. It's all doctrine. It's extremely boring. I mean, extremely boring. Much of early Middle English literature is like that. It's doctrinal and it's boring. Okay? That remains thin and cheap when he has finished with it. That is, if the matter isn't great, then what comes as a result of the writing, the art put around the matter, will also not be great. There must be greatness in the stuff of the story. So, Tolkien. Or that he should, in the selection of the material and the choice of what to put forward, what to keep subordinate upon the outer edges, have shown a puerile simplicity much below the level of the characters he himself draws in his own poem. He says, any theory that will at least allow us to believe that what he did was of design, and that for that design there is a defense that may still have force, would seem more probable. He's getting to his point. Maybe there's a reason why the dragon and the monsters are at the center of the poem, and these things are at the outside. So maybe it's incumbent upon the reader to discover what that reason is. So, next paragraph, skipping a couple lines, he says, it cannot, I think, be disputed that Beowulf is more beautiful than, for example, Cynewulf's Andreas or Gudlach. All right, the writings of Cynewulf or the Andreas or of Gudlach, sorry. That Beowulf is more beautiful, that each line there is more significant, even when, as sometimes happens, it is the same line. What he's talking about there is the use of formula. That is, there are lines of poetry in Old English that show up in multiple places. The same exact line shows up in Beowulf and shows up in Andreas. And what Tolkien is saying here is that in Beowulf, that same exact line has more force. It has more profundity than it does in the Andreas, than in the other long English poems. Where then resides the special virtue of Beowulf? That is, why does everyone say Beowulf is the greatest work of Old English literature? If the common element, which belongs largely to the language itself and to a literary tradition, is deducted, it resides in the theme. The same theme that, if we go back to one of the earlier passages, somebody said, the theme was childish or something like that. So, he says the paradoxical contrast that has been drawn between matter and Beowulf has thus an inherent literary improbability. Why have the critics thought otherwise? And he says, I have to pass over this quickly. So we're going to skip over that paragraph and go to the next one. There is also, I suppose, a real question of taste involved. A judgment that the heroic or tragic story on a strictly human plane is by nature superior. Okay, look at that again. The heroic or tragic story on a strictly human plane, no supernatural elements at all, is by nature superior. He says, this proposition seems to have been passed as self-evident. I dissent. Skip a few sentences. Folk tales in being, as told, for the typical folk tale, of course, is merely an abstract conception of research nowhere existing. Folk tales, in being as told, do often contain elements that are thin and cheap, with little even potential virtue. But they also contain much that is far more powerful, and that cannot be sharply separated from myth, being derived from it, or capable in poetic hands of turning into it. The significance of a myth is not easily to be penned on paper by analytical reasoning. It's very similar to what he said in the fairy story essay about fairy stories.
What is a fairy story?
Yeah, and being able to define them. It is at its best when it is presented by a poet who feels rather than makes explicit what his theme portends. And when he says who feels, he means when the poet feels it in his bones. And in so doing, makes the audience feel it, not be able to rationally put it into words, who presents it incarnate in the world of history and geography, as our poet has done. That is, who embeds that feeling in the atmosphere, the total world experience of the poem. Okay? Go to the next paragraph. It does not seem plain that ancient taste supports the modern as much as it has been represented to do. That is, that the ancient taste in literary construction and stuff supports the modern approach and taste and such. So, Tolkien says, I've got the author of Beowulf on my side.
I love that line. That was my favorite thing.
A greater man than most of us. And I cannot myself perceive a period in the North when one kind alone was esteemed. There was room for myth and heroic legend, and for blends of these. As for the dragon, as far as we know anything about these old poets, we know this. The prince of the heroes of the North, supremely memorable, Hans naven mun upi medan felden stendar, his name shall live while the world lasts. That Sigmundur was a dragon slayer. In later Germanic legends, Sigmundur gets replaced with Siegfried. Okay. His most renowned deed is as the slayer of Fafnir. Tolkien says, with his title, Fafnisbani, was the slaying of the prince of legendary worms. Beowulf will be compared to this dragon slayer. Okay? And he goes on, long passage about that, which I want to skip. Go down to the next paragraph, Beowulf's dragon. Beowulf's dragon, if one wishes really to criticize, is not to be blamed for being a dragon, but not for being dragon enough. Plain, pure, fairy story dragon. Okay? He says the poem comes close, gives us touches of this, but there's more to it than that. He says, he then moved quickly, translation of the Old English, he then moved quickly along by the rock, in which this dragon is real worm, with a bestial life and a thought of his own. But the conception nonetheless approaches dragonitas, dragonness. That the dragon in the poem approaches the idea of what a dragon ought to be, rather than a real flesh and blood dragon. Rather than Draco, it is a personification of malice, greed, destruction, and of the undiscriminating cruelty of fortune that distinguishes not good or bad. But for Beowulf, the poem that is as it should be. In this poem, the balance is nice, but it's preserved. That is, in the poem Beowulf, as we have it, the dragon is both Draco and this. It is both the dragon itself and a personification of what ultimately avarice. Okay? Ultimately. So that the dragon does what? The dragon hoards treasure. The dragon awakens when a single piece of the treasure leaves.
If I could go off on a tangent here, like, is there ever an example in Western literature where dragons aren't the personification of some sort of greed or avarice? Because I can't really think of one. Even St. George's dragon, is at least gluttonous.
Well, Fafnir isn't really.
Well, doesn't he? He does sit on a pile of treasure.
Yeah, he sits on a pile of treasure, but it's not this element of greed where he attacks anybody and anything that comes near. That is, Fafnir is a little bit different in that, according to some recensions of the myth, Fafnir is someone who had been a dwarf,
Right, and
who fell asleep on a dragon hoard,
in
etc.
the Volsunga saga, I think that's a hoard he stole from his brother,
Yeah.
if I remember correctly, and then, and so, yeah, I mean, but it's still sort of, it's a very,
Yeah.
he hoards treasure and everything like that.
But what Tolkien's getting at here is that the dragon in Beowulf starts to become more of this, and the poet stops. He doesn't become what later critics will say, or will sometimes suggest, and Chambers kind of suggested this in the quote that Tolkien used, personification of evil and an enemy of God. There's nothing in the poem that suggests that the dragon in the poem is the enemy of God. Now, the poem does suggest that Grendel bore God's anger, and that Grendel is in a feud with God, but not the dragon. Okay?
Is that some separation we're supposed to understand with the form that Grendel takes, as opposed to the worm form? He's more humanoid.
Yeah, definitely, because of his being a descendant of Cain.
So he kind of ends up being a representation of man's fallenness, in a sense, in that case. Like,
Possibly, but I don't think anything in the poem suggests that Grendel is a representation
of anything.
Yeah. Grendel's Grendel. And that's part of what Tolkien is trying to get across here. So he goes on. The large symbolism is near the surface, but it does not break through nor become allegory. That is, the dragon doesn't represent avarice. It doesn't represent greed.
It is just avaricious. It is greedy.
It's a dragon.
Yeah.
That's part of a dragon's nature. Okay? It doesn't become mere symbol. So, something more significant than a standard hero. A man faced with a foe more evil than any human enemy of house or realm is before us. And this is the important point. And yet incarnate in time. Walking in heroic history, treading the named lands of the north. And this, we are told, is the radical defect of Beowulf. That its author, coming in a time rich in the legends of heroic men, has used them afresh in an original fashion, giving us not just one more, but something akin yet different, a measure and interpretation of them all. That is, the Beowulf poet takes all this rich tradition and makes something brand new. And something that, in being brand new, Tolkien says it is an interpretation of what comes before, and it is a measure. You can use it as a measuring stick for this other material. We do not deny the worth of the hero by accepting Grendel and the dragon. Let us by all means esteem the old heroes, men caught in the change of circumstance or of their own character. Okay, notice that. Caught in the change of circumstance. They're bound by necessity or in the change of their own character, their own actions brought about by their own internal foibles. Put them in positions that they don't like. Torn between duties equally sacred, dying with their backs to the wall. We have the proverb, between a rock and a hard place. Okay? Notice, they are pushed and they're dying. There's not an escape route. Beowulf, I fancy, plays a larger part than is recognized in helping us to esteem them, that is, these old heroes. Heroic lays may have dealt in their own way, a way more brief and vigorous perhaps, though perhaps also more harsh and noisy, with the actions of heroes caught in circumstances that conform more or less to the varied but fundamentally simple recipe for an heroic situation. If we had them, we could see the exaltation of undefeated will which receives doctrinal expression in the words of Berchtwald at the Battle of Malden. The words of Berchtwald at the Battle of Malden are in footnote 12. Wait, is that right?
11.
Yeah.
Right.
Is it?
I see an 11 here after all.
Is it the one that begins this expression?
The actual words are in 12.
Yeah, the actual words are in 12. They're not to that footnote 11. Footnote 12. The words, He shall the hydra, heritage the kenra, mod shall the mara, the uramayan littleth. Courage shall be the bolder, heart the keener, spirit shall be the greater, as our strength grows less. Berchtwald is an old, grizzled retainer at the Battle of Malden. And his lord is already dead, Berchtnoth. And Berchtwald and the other surviving retainers are standing, forming a circle around their dead lord's body. And he says these lines fairly near to the end of the poem. Okay, the poem that we have is incomplete. But he says these lines near to the end. And what the image it creates is that you've got half a dozen men, and they're still taking on 100 Vikings. You know, and a spear gets thrown, and one of the guys goes down, and now there's 5. And another spear gets thrown, and now there's 4. And he utters these lines. Courage shall be the bolder, heart the keener, spirit the greater, as our strength grows less. In other words, we have got to use modern language, suck it up even more. We've got to stand firmer, we've got to stand taller, we've got to fight fiercer as we dwindle. Now, that is a foreign concept to our modern way of thinking. Okay? Our modern way of thinking says, if there's absolutely no chance you can win, give up. What does Falstaff say in Henry IV, Part 1? Discretion is the better part of valor. Okay? So, but with sympathy and patience we might gather from a line here or a tone there the background of imagination which gives to this indomitability, this paradox of defeat, inevitable yet unacknowledged, its full significance. That is, the significance isn't in the defeat. It is in Beowulf that a poet has devoted a whole poem to the theme. What theme? Those lines, as it were, from the Battle of Malden. And has drawn the struggle in different proportions so that we may see man at war with the hostile world and his inevitable overthrow in time. The particular is on the outer edge. The essential in the center. The particular. These digressions and episodes, each of which in the poem has to do with the idea of feud, conflict, is on the outer edge. And he says the essence, the heart, the central problem is at the center. Because what ultimately is the central problem? Beowulf must die. That's it. Why? Why is that the central problem? He calls that, in the fairy story essay, the central thing humanity wants to find an escape from: death. Okay? When we have read this poem, or his poem, a couple lines down, as a poem, rather than as a collection of episodes, we perceive that he who wrote Haleth under heavenum, heroes under heaven, may have meant in dictionary terms heroes under heaven, or mighty men upon earth. But he and his hearers were thinking of the Ermengrund, the great earth. ringed with garsedge, the shoreless sea, beneath the sky's inaccessible roof, whereon, and this is a beautiful image, and he uses this in The Lord of the Rings, whereon, as in a little circle of light about their halls, men with courage as their stay. A stay is something that helps you stand upright. It keeps you firm. Okay? With courage as their stay, went forward to that battle with the hostile world and the offspring of the dark, which ends for all, even the kings and champions, in defeat. So you have this image of these men in these halls, and a little ray of sunshine shines from behind an ever-darkening sky. Okay? And they're arming themselves for battle to go out and do what? Die. They're not going out to do battle because they think they can win. They're going out to do battle because they know they will die. And what do? They fight anyways. That's the heroic element. Okay? He goes on and says, Beowulf, next paragraph, Beowulf is not then the hero of an heroic lay. He is a man, and that for him and many is sufficient tragedy. That's the tragedy. He's a man. Now you can make that, non-gender specific and say he's a person. It's used, Lord of the Rings. The tragedy of Éowyn is that she is a woman, period. Alive, in Middle Earth. And what does that mean? Death will come. That's it. Okay? It is the theme in its deadly seriousness that begets the dignity of tone. And this is why I love the Old English poem, The Wanderer, so much. Lif is lena, al sheketh lecht, and lif somod. Life is transitory. Light and life together hasten away. There's a passage in The Wanderer, Lif bith lena. Life is lean. Frowned bith lena. Friend is lean. Lean meaning transitory, not lasting. Okay? Man is transitory. Women are transitory. Gifts are transitory. Wealth is transitory. Everything in this earth, the Old English poet says of The Wanderer, says, will lie waste. Okay? Tolkien says, it's coming up pretty soon, where he's talking about the theme of the poem. Tolkien's going to say that essentially all Old English poetry is about one thing: the death of man and all his works. Period. So, I would suggest, next paragraph, that the monsters are not an inexplicable blunder of taste, they are essential, fundamentally allied to the underlying ideas of the poem which give it its lofty tone and high seriousness. So he says, what you have to do is figure out why it works the way it does. So, he quotes Chambers, where Chambers says, where is this Kerr again? Where it says that the Grendlekin and the dragon are foes of God. It says, most important is it to consider how and why the monsters become adversaries of God, and so begin to symbolize the powers of evil, even while they remain, as they do still remain in Beowulf, mortal denizens of the material world. Okay? And he goes on, he talks about the dating of the poem, and says, I accept without argument that the poem is early. It comes from the age of Bede. That means roughly 675 to 730 or so. The poem was composed sometime in that period. Okay? And he goes on and he says, what does the poet from that time period do? He fuses together two things. Christian learning and Anglo-Saxon paganism, Anglo-Saxon mythology. He says, in that paragraph, there are some hints here, right at the end of it. In the poem, I think we may observe not confusion, a half-hearted or a muddled business, but a fusion that has occurred at a given point of contact between old and new, a product of thought and deep emotion. A fusion of what? A fusion of the new Christian thinking and the old pagan way of life. One of the most potent elements in that fusion is the northern courage, the theory of courage, that I'm going to fight until my last breath. Okay? And he goes on and says, I refer rather to the central position the creed of unyielding will holds in the North. With due reserve, we may turn to the tradition of pagan imagination as it arrived in Iceland. And he goes on and talks about some things in Icelandic, and he talks about Kerr, etc. But after the passage with Kerr, new paragraph, he says, but in England, this imagination was brought into touch with Christendom and with the scriptures. And what happens? An alchemy of change was at once at work. One does not have to wait until all the native traditions of the old world have been replaced or forgotten. For the mind which still retains them, or the minds which still retain them, are changed, and the memories viewed in a different perspective. At once, they become more ancient and remote, and in a sense, darker. What in the world is Tolkien talking about? The minds, he says, that are changed. What are these? These are the old pagan minds. Okay? What's in those old pagan minds? Pagan ideas. Okay? And memories. And traditions. Ultimately, pagan stories. And he says, once the minds change, once they accept the new story, Christianity, what does that do to these? It doesn't obliterate them. It doesn't erase them. What does it do? It makes them look older. Why? Because the mind now has new light shining in it. And these become part of the collective and the individual past. What does St. Paul call the Christian? The new man. And the pre-Christian is the old man. So it becomes older, darker. He doesn't mean darker, less light. He means darker, more somber, more solemn, graver, more serious. Well, why? Because think about the people in this position without the new light. What do they have to look forward to? What hope do they have? None. The poet in Beowulf says at one point in the poem, fairly early on, after Grendel first starts marauding, what did they do? They looked to the old tradition of the heathens. They went back to their old ways. They sought help from the slayer of souls. In other words, he says, they didn't have any hope. They didn't know any way out. Okay? So Tolkien says, it is through such a blending that there was available to a poet who set out to write a poem. And in the case of Beowulf, we may probably use this very word, that is a poem, on a scale and plan unlike a minstrel's lay. Both new faith and new learning, and also a body of native tradition for the changed mind to contemplate together. That is, the poet set out to blend the old native tradition and learning with this new faith and new hope. But notice what Beowulf never has in it. Christ, or Christian, or Mary, or Joseph, or Peter, Paul, John, James, any of the apostles. It has no New Testament names at all. And it has only one Old Testament name, Cain. So, he cast his time into the long ago. Why? Because already the long ago had a special poetical attraction. Now, we don't know what the long ago meant for the Beowulf poet. You know, the poem says, What? Legardena in Year Dagum. We Spear Danes in days of yore have heard. Okay? We heard stories about in a galaxy a long time ago, as it were. Because to the poet, that time long ago already had a special meaning. How do most fairy tales begin? Once upon a time. What does that mean? Does that mean yesterday? No, it means a long time ago. So, he knew much about old days, and though his knowledge of such things as sea burial and a funeral pyre, for instance, was rich and poetical, rather than accurate with the accuracy of modern archaeology, such as it is, one thing he knew clearly: those days were heathen. Notice how he qualifies. Heathen, noble, and hopeless. Why noble?
Well, he has dignity. There's a
What are they trying to do?
Attitude, courage.
Yeah, they're doing the best they can. They don't know any better. They don't know any other way to confront time. Okay? And they fight with their back up against the wall. They don't give up.
No, it's interesting that the way Tolkien characterizes this as him as the poet portraying a people without hope. Even though there's several there's several points in the dialogue where they make reference to apparently a monotheistic deity of some kind. So, the characterization of the people of the poem is a little.
Often, however, the characterization of that hope doesn't come from the voice or the mouth or mouths of people within the world of the poem. It comes from the poet.
Well, it does a couple of times.
It does a couple of times.
Yeah,
Hrothgar says one thing, Beowulf says one thing at one time. And Tolkien does mention that. It's only those two that it really comes from.
Mm.
And that's the fusion. That's the blending together. It's never Christian.
But it is.
It's never, believe on the Lord Jesus Christ and you'll be saved, and you won't go to Valhalla or hell, you'll go to heaven. No, it's always very subtle. It's, look for hope from the Father of embracing arms kind of a thing, or the judgment of the righteous. But even that language, seek the judgment of the righteous, for example. That's not Germanic, not at all. Seek the eternal soul's embrace in the arms of the Father. Well, first of all, in Germanic mythology, the soul is not eternal. It will be destroyed at the end of time, when the frost giants and the dwarves and the orcs and the elves win, and humanity and the gods are destroyed. Okay, that's one of the points he really hits on here, is that, in this old mythology, there is no hope. There is no hope whatsoever in terms of a mindset of, oh, don't worry, Johnny, Frodo, things will get better. No, they won't. In this mythology, things can only get worse.
So, all right. So obviously, the poet's constructing this world. How would we characterize the belief system of the characters in this world then? Because they do make reference to certain monotheistic things, don't make really explicit reference to any pagan deity.
They sound monotheistic.
Yeah,
That's about as far as you can go.
yeah.
There aren't any references to pagan gods. And Tolkien makes it clear that is probably an aspect of the poet's artistry, where he almost seems to suggest that maybe in an early version of the poem, there might have been a reference to Thor or Odin or something. But in revising, the poet goes through and takes all that out intentionally. Okay? So, he talks about, those days were heathen, noble, and hopeless. But if the specifically Christian was suppressed, so also were the old gods. Why? Partly because according to the modern, meaning the time period in which the Christian poet was writing, because the modern Christian poet believed this, because they had not really existed. That is, the Christian said, especially after he had become a Christian, Thor wasn't real. Maybe there was a being like Thor. He wasn't a god. What was he? A demon. A fallen angel. Attempting to persuade us that he was a god, etc. Or delusions or lies fabricated by the evil one, to whom the hopeless turned, especially in times of need. Partly, that is, they were suppressed, because their old names, certainly not forgotten, had been potent. That is, the poet keeps the names out of here because, like the mere mention of alcohol to an alcoholic could be enough to get him a little twitchy. And the mere mention of the pagan gods' names could be enough for maybe some members of an audience to go back to the old ways.
So I guess that does lend some credence to an early dating of the poem then, right? Because
Possibly.
if it's around 900, that would be less of a fear, wouldn't that?
Possibly. But, people are the same. Whether it's people in 2014 or people in 914. Well, what do I mean by that? We have a pagan society on MTSU's campus.
Yeah.
There are people today who believe, I don't mean they see Chris Hemsworth as Thor. I mean, they believe and they pray to Thor and Odin and Freya and Freyr and all the Vanir and Aesir. Okay? Tolkien is saying, really, in whatever day and age, there are always some who kind of hold on to this, who don't, quote unquote, convert. So, he goes on, the monsters had been the foes of the gods. The captains of men, that is, the monsters had been calling the shots, and within time, the monsters would win. Now, the heroic figures, the men of old, the heroes under heaven, remained and still fought on until defeat. For the monsters do not depart whether the gods go or come. A Christian was and is still, like his forefathers, a mortal hemmed in a hostile world. The monsters remained the enemies of mankind, the infantry of the old war, and became inevitably the enemies of the one God, Echtedrichten, the eternal captain of the new. That is, the monsters are captains of the old. This old mindset. They're holdovers. But he's saying the Christian in the new world, so to speak, in the new light of Christianity, still lives in that old world. And still has to do what? Still has to face time. Just because he becomes a Christian doesn't mean he doesn't die. Just because he becomes a Christian doesn't mean he doesn't face trial and tribulation. In fact, just the opposite if he really understands what Christ taught. He will face trial and tribulation. Blessed are you. What? When everything's going your way? No. When men shall revile you and persecute you for my name, etc. So, he says the tragedy of the great temporal defeat remains for a while poignant, but ceases to be finally poignant. What does temporal mean? Inside time. Notice, this is a defeat now that we're talking about. that is bound by time. Because what does the Christian hope give? There's something, exactly. Eternity. Outside time. See, the Germanic mindset was totally fixed in this. There was nothing beyond time. And when this world, when this world ended, bound in time, that would be the end for the forces of good, the gods and men. Who would be left? The forces of evil. Okay? And that's all there would be. Christianity comes and says, why? Because there's a larger world. The world of eternity that comes before and goes beyond after. Okay? Look at what Tolkien says here. The tragedy of the great temporal defeat remains for a while poignant. When does it especially remain poignant? When you're still in it. When you're the one with your back to the wall and you got 100 screaming, crazy, mad Vikings coming at you, and there are 6 of you fighting, holding them off. But it ceases to be finally important. Or here, I'll give you a real world example. One that will make your stomach turn. Report came out today. 17-year-old girl held by the Islamic State. This was an article in The Telegraph, one of London's newspapers. She and about 40 other women being held. They've been held since late July. And she talks in this interview about the horrific experiences. She and these other women, some as young as 13, some going up into their 40s and 50s, daily endure multiple rapes a day by multiple men. And this has been going on for her for over a month. And she's 17. And she says, sometimes we begged them, we asked them to kill us, etc. Okay? For obvious reasons. And she says, if I ever get out of here, I don't know if I will ever be able to get beyond this. My body is destroyed. My mind is going. Okay? Talk about the temporal defeat. She's in there, in that rock, between a rock and a hard place. She's praying, she says, for either the Kurds or the Americans to rescue them, to help them. How was her story able to get out? The Islamic State bastards gave all these women back their cell phones. Why? So they could tell people how horrific they are as a warning. That it's not going to stop here. It's going to go to Baghdad, it's going to go to Mosul, it's going to go to the Islamic Caliphate. Okay? But there appears, it is no defeat. For the end of the world is part of the design of Method, the arbiter who is above the mortal world. Beyond, there appears a possibility of eternal victory. And that's what Beowulf seems to allude to or Hrothgar, when he says, seek the judgment of the righteous. Okay? And the real battle is between the soul and its adversaries. Which is what? The soul is also constrained here within time. Okay? And the adversaries are also temporal adversaries. Because once the body dies, the soul at that point is free. Now, yes, in Christian doctrine, it is free in one of 2 places. Or if you're Catholic, 3. Okay? Heaven, hell, possibly purgatory. But it's free from those temptations. In hell, it's no longer being tempted. Then it's just suffering. In heaven, it's in bliss. In purgatory, it's in suffering, but that's leading to bliss. It's not permanent. So, So the old monsters became images of the evil spirit or spirits, the temptations. Or rather, the evil spirits entered into the monsters and took visible shape in the hideous bodies of the Thyrsus and Sigalfaren, the Ethiopians of heathen imagination. Beowulf's author is still concerned primarily with man on earth. Hold on just one second. Rehandling in a new perspective an ancient theme. Okay, notice, here's what he says. This is the theme. That man, each man, and all men, and all their works shall die. And previous critics said that the poem didn't have a serious or weighty matter. No. Tolkien is saying this is the theme of the poem. They don't get really much more deep than that. Everybody must die. So what does that mean? Prepare for death. Learn how to die. Question, Gregory? Or
Yeah, I
comment?
was just sort of wondering about these words like Thyrsus. What, like you said, Sigil here one means Ethiopians. Or-
Yeah,
Okay, what does Thyrsus mean?
giant.
Giant.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
Those are Old English forms for the words.
So the religious ambiguity in the poem is obviously intentional. Should
Yes.
we understand some personal ambiguity on the part of the author? He's obviously learned to know, to have an understanding of the Christian ideology, but
Yeah, I don't think Tolkien thinks that there's any personal ambiguity on the part of the author. I think Tolkien thinks that the author writes the poem in this way because,
larger audience.
yeah, I think it's the audience. Okay. If he writes a purely Christian poem, like some of the other poems Tolkien has mentioned, the poems by, Kenilworth, for example, or the Andreas, or the translation of Genesis, etc., they're overtly Christian. He mentions Judith at one point. Judith is about an Old Testamental apocryphal hero. She shows up in an apocryphal book of the Old Testament called the Book of Judith. And in the poem, however, you have Judith talking about Christ and the Trinity. Well, that's anachronistic because Christ wasn't around yet. Okay, so there are some claims that the Israelites had an idea of the Trinity, but that it hadn't really been fleshed out and such. Tolkien's essentially saying this poet's doing something different because this poet is looking back on an ancient English period, not an Israeli or Hebrew period, but on an ancient English period that is entirely and thoroughly pagan. And what he wants to do is I'm going to use a term that C.S. Lewis uses, baptize it. It doesn't mean he's whitewashing it. It doesn't mean he's Christianizing it in the sense of, it's okay, Johnny, everything's going to be okay. Jesus will take you up into heaven now, kind of thing. No, what he's saying is, there's a lot of crap in this world, and you got to deal with it, and you got to die, and everybody must die. But this world isn't the end. See, in Germanic mythology, that's it. It's it entirely. This world is all there is. And you see that. Read Bede's History of the English Church. And Bede talks about the Christianization of England. And he recounts a story that pretty much was the deciding story that swayed many people to accept Christianity. And in this story, one of the pagan king's priests says, King, here I am, I'm your chief priest, I'm the best person of our religion in terms of I really believe it, I really practice it, and what good has it done me? You've overlooked me when it comes to giving of gifts and stuff hundreds of times. And the king's kind of like, yeah, I get your point. You know, the old religion, prayers to the old gods hasn't done you a lot of good. And then another guy says, king, it sounds kind of like this. Our lives are like the lives of the sparrow. And this sparrow is flying, and it's flying in cold and dark, and it's snowing and hailing, and just miserable weather. And it flies through a window in a hall. And it comes into the hall, and what does it experience? It experiences light, it experiences warmth, it experiences joy, it experiences revelry. There's singing, there's laughter. And it exists for a while here, and then it flies out through another window and goes off into the darkness again. And he said, our lives are kind of like that sparrow when it's in the hall. We understand some things here, but we don't know where we came from, and we don't know where we're going. Our religion says nothing about these two things, but this guy's story tells us where we came from, and more importantly, tells us where we can go. This guy's story tells us we're made in the image of the one who made everything, and we can be united to him. I don't know about you, O king, but this story makes a whole hell of a lot more sense than our story does. And the king says, yeah, I think so. I'm going with the story behind door number 2. So, Tolkien says, this is a theme no Christian need despise. Yet this theme plainly would not be so treated but for the nearness of a pagan time, which gets to both of your questions. Your question earlier about the time of composition and your comment about, whether or not the author was ambiguous in his own beliefs. Tolkien says, no, he writes the way he does because he's not writing about a time long, long ago. Maybe the poet is a Christian convert, and he's writing about 3 years ago, metaphorically speaking, about the time when he thought like this. When he thought like Hrothgar, things will never change. Grendel is at the door every night, and has been for 12 years. And guess what? He's going to be there tonight, and tomorrow night, and for the next not 12 years, the next 50 years. And then I die. And there's nothing left. That maybe the poet was of that mindset, became a Christian, and then thought, I could write a pretty good story that combines these two and that helps people in this mindset to adopt the new mindset. The shadow of its despair, that the despair of the pagan time, if only as a mood, as an intense emotion of regret, is still there. And I would argue that shadow of despair, that's what permeates The Lord of the Rings. And that's what Peter Jackson, it's one of the things Peter Jackson has no clue about. Where is the quote-unquote hope in The Lord of the Rings? There is none. It's the end of an age. What will the next age be?
Age of Man.
Ours. The age of man. The elves will go, the hobbits will go, the dwarves will go. It's our time. Okay? And Peter Jackson had Gandalf tell Pippin, and I can't remember which film it is.
It's the Return of the King, I think, if you're thinking of.
It's either I think it is Return of the King. It's on their.
It's Minas Tirith.
Well, it's on their way to Minas Tirith, and Gandalf essentially tells Pippin. I can't remember the phrase exactly, but it's something. It's something akin to Yoda's telling Obi-Wan, "No, there is another one. That there's another possible hope. If Luke turns, there's still, Princess Leia." He essentially says, there's another place. There's another world. Okay. Huge, stupid, glaring problem with that. There is no other place in other world within Tolkien's cosmology for hobbits. Tolkien never explains that the hobbits can possibly end up in the quote-unquote Christian heaven. In the 12-volume History of Middle-earth, he does say, this is where man goes. It's the gift of death of Eru Iluvatar to men. And that's something the elves don't understand. This is all in the Silmarillion, by the way, or most of it is.
Which
But not the Hobbit,
obviously Peter Jackson didn't read.
or not the Hobbits. No, but he wants to do a film. Okay.
No, but that's actually during the battle at Minas Tirith.
Okay.
With their,
So he says, the worth of defeated valor in this world is deeply felt. As the poet looks back into the past, surveying the history of kings and warriors in the old traditions, he sees that all glory. But what does he mean by glory? Tolkien supplies culture, civilization. Or let's use the phrase he used earlier, all the works of man. End in night. Complete, total darkness. The solution of that tragedy is not treated. Why? It does not arise out of the material. That is, the Christian gospel doesn't fit here. Why? It would be anachronistic. It wouldn't belong in this tale. So, we get in fact a poem from a pregnant moment of poise, looking back into the pit by a man learned in old tales who was struggling, as it were, to get a general view of them all, perceiving their common tragedy of inevitable ruin, and yet feeling this more poetically. That is, he's looking at these heroes in the past, and he feels it in his bones, the despair that they had. Why? Because he was himself removed from the direct pressure of despair. He feels their loss so much because he knows he has a hope. He has an escape. Okay? Kind of like the elves, who don't feel the loss of Middle-earth as deeply as will, for example, Frodo. Why? They can go to Valinor. But Valinor is actually part of Arda, and it will be wiped away at the making of the new heaven and new earth in Tolkien's cosmology. The elves are totally tied to the world. There is no place in heaven for the elves. Okay? Only man, nor the dwarves. The dwarves are creatures of the world. Probably the hobbits are also. So,
well, no, I jumping ahead at this point, but like, no, I know it. He does mention though that like there's certain people who have some hobbit blood in them, which like there's like he mentions like interbreeding between hobbits and men. Do you not remember that part? Like I can't remember if it's actually towards the beginning or towards the end of the.
might be in the prologue.
Yeah.
Where there's talk because of the Tooks being a little taller, but I don't remember there being anything about interbreeding between them.
Yeah, but he mentions like there might be people today who still have hobbit blood in them or something along those lines, and
that I don't remember.
Which might suggest maybe that the hobbits are more akin to man in that respect than in terms of their eternality. I don't know.
That I don't know. Go to the next paragraph.
I'll be watching.
So he goes on and says, we might say that the poem was inspired by the debate that had long been held and continued after. That is, what do we do with the heathens who existed before Christ? And let's be magnanimous here. What do we do with Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, who everybody would acknowledge were good guys? What do we do with Gautama Buddha? Lao Tzu.
Well, if you're Dante, you put them in limbo.
Okay, if you're Dante, you put them in limbo.
Yeah.
Some of the early church fathers said No, they go to heaven. They did what they could with the best they had based upon the knowledge they had. What was the knowledge they had? Some of these early writers say that's what St. Paul was talking about when he talks about the law of God being written on their heart. They followed the law of God that they had in them. They didn't follow the scriptures because they didn't have those. And he quotes a letter by Alcuin of York, who Charlemagne invited and became Charlemagne's tutor for his children and the children at his school in Aachen. Quid hineldes cum Christo? What has ENGL to do with Christ? Alcuin wrote that letter back to a bunch of monks in York because word reached him that at the dinner meal, in the refectory, rather than all the monks eating quietly and having one senior monk standing up at a lectern and reading, like the Lives of Saints or the Psalms or a homily or something like that, they were reading stories about Ingjald, pagan, Germanic, god, and hero. And Alcuin about busted a gut. What are you doing? What has Ingjald to do with Christ? So, the author of Beowulf showed forth the permanent value of that pietas, that is, that devotion, which treasures the memory of man's struggles in the dark past, man fallen and not yet saved, disgraced but not dethroned. In other words, what the author of Beowulf shows is this is what Ingjald has to do with Christ. Ingjald did his best. Ingjald followed the law of God written on his heart. Beowulf essentially kind of takes that step further because Beowulf is not like the other kings in the story. We'll talk about this a little bit more later. We won't get into it tonight. So, into the next paragraph. We have the great pagan on the threshold of the change of the world, and the great if lesser Christian just over the threshold of the great change in his time and place, the backward view. The great pagan, Beowulf, is standing on the threshold, kind of looking into the darkness. He doesn't see the hope on the other side. The Christian poet looks back and, as it were, sees Beowulf looking towards him. And it's almost like he's going, over here. And then he goes on and talks about the monsters. Why the emphasis on the monsters? He says the monsters are at the center. Why? Because the big long paragraph that begins at this point in particular, at the end of that paragraph, he says, in Norse at any rate, the gods are within time, doomed with their allies to death. Their battle is with the monsters and the outer darkness. And then he starts to compare them with southern gods, the Mediterranean gods, the Greek and Roman gods. And says, the Greek and Roman gods look more godlike because they don't die. But it also doesn't allow us to kind of empathize with them. So he says, for these reasons, I think that the passages in Beowulf, the next paragraph, concerning the giants and their war with God, together with the two mentions of Cain, are especially important. They are directly connected with Scripture, yet they cannot be dissociated from the creatures of northern myth. He says, they are precisely the elements which bear upon this theme. Man alien in a hostile world, engaged in a struggle which he cannot win while the world lasts, is assured that his foes are the foes also of God, Drichten, and that his courage, noble in itself, is also the highest loyalty. By fighting the gods, by fighting the monsters, what are Beowulf and Beowulf and all the others doing? Unbeknownst to them,
They're fighting on behalf of
they're
God.
fighting on God's side. They are taking part in the great battle. Okay? In Beowulf, we have then an historical poem about the pagan past. It is a poem by a learned man writing of old times, who, looking back on the heroism and sorrow, feels in them something permanent and something symbolical. That is, he looks back and he says, I can learn something from this. He brought probably first to his task a knowledge of Christian poetry, especially the cabinet school, and then secondly, he did what? He brought considerable learning in native lays and traditions. And what does he do? He joins the two. He fuses them so that they can't be separated. There are people who try to remove the quote-unquote Christian imagery in Beowulf. It cannot be done. It's like trying to remove, just like what Thomas Jefferson tried to do in removing the quote-unquote mythological elements of the New Testament. The virgin birth, the resurrection of the dead, all the miracles. What do you end up with?
A really, really boring story for one thing.
You end up with platitudes.
Yeah.
You end up with platitudes. It would seem then that in his attempt to depict ancient pre-Christian days, intending to emphasize their nobility and the desire of the good for truth, he turned naturally when delineating the great king of Heorot to the Old Testament, which is why Hrothgar sounds like a prophet. He sounds like Elijah sometimes. Well, what are the Old Testament prophets always having to confront? What are the people always doing? Which is why God speaks to the prophets. They're always falling away. And God sends a prophet to do what? To bring them back. Okay? We have, in fact, a Christian English conception of the noble chief before Christianity who could lapse in times of temptation into idolatry. Okay? He then goes on and says, but the Beowulf that we have isn't necessarily historically accurate. It's not a real picture of historic Denmark. The whole, he says, must have succeeded admirably in creating in the minds of the poet's contemporaries the illusion of surveying a past, pagan but noble and fraught with a deep significance, a past that itself had depth and reached backward into a dark antiquity of sorrow. This is really important what he says here, because of its application to the Lord of the Rings. This impression of depth is an effect and a justification of the use of episodes and allusions to old tales, mostly darker, more pagan, and desperate than the foreground. These things are on the outside, because the outside, if you have a circle of light, is where? It's where the light gets darker. It's these on the outside, these little stories and allusions that give the central tale its sense of depth. It's sense of a 3D image that you have layer after layer after layer after layer of time. Okay? And he says, and that's central to what's going on. Skip the next paragraph where he talks about the Aeneid. I'm trying to get through this quickly so we can go. He then talks about the structure of the poem, and then people say, well, the poem doesn't have a narrative structure. It doesn't advance a central, plot, etc. He says it wasn't supposed to. The poem was not meant to advance steadily or unsteadily. It's a balance. What's in a balance of? Ends and beginnings. How does it begin? We see the rise of Beowulf. How does it end? We see the death of Beowulf. That's it. Is it perfectly balanced and with an exact center point? No. It's a tale of the rising and setting, an elaboration of the ancient and intensely moving contrast between youth and age, first achievement and final death. That's it. Okay? I'll skip that. The paragraph that begins, "This is clear in the second half." He says at the end of the paragraph, by now, this is like by line 2800, by now we're supposed to have grasped the plan. Disaster is foreboded. That doesn't mean it's forbidden. It means he's foreshadowing it. Defeat is the theme. And it's interesting that around line 1600, I think it is, the Beowulf poet tells us, oh, Beowulf's going to die in the fight with the dragon. I mean, he implies before we even see a dragon, kind of how Beowulf's going to die. But we are supposed to have grasped the plan. Disaster is foreboded, defeat is the theme. Triumph over the foes of man's precarious fortress is over, and we approach slowly and reluctantly the inevitable victory of death. That is, Beowulf's defeat of the dragon, even though he dies, is a victory. Okay? One last thing. The beginning of the very last paragraph. Skipping the appendix. We're not going to talk about the various names in the appendices. One last point. Which those will feel who today preserve the ancient pietas towards the past. That is, disrespect and devotion towards the past. Beowulf is not a primitive poem. It is a late one. Using the materials then still plentiful, preserved from a day already changing and passing, even though he already said the poem is early. It's a little inconsistency there. A time that is now forever vanished, swallowed in oblivion. A time that using them for a new purpose with a wider sweep of imagination, if with a less bitter and concentrated force. When new, Beowulf was already antiquarian. That is, when the ink was dry on the parchment, the story that was told was already seemingly ancient in a good sense, and it now produces a singular effect. For it is now to us itself ancient. That is, it's over 1,000 years old for us. When it was composed, it was supposed to have the feeling of being 1,000 years old. And yet its maker was telling of things already old and weighted with regret, and he expended his art in making keen that touch upon the heart which sorrows have that are both poignant and remote. In other words, the poet was wanting to create this sense of poignant loss in the hearers. Okay? All right. Questions or comments? I don't want to say anything about the translation. I want to let you just, having read this, assuming you've read the translation.
Although I think I actually made a mistake in reading the translation first. I think if I went back and read this, having read the essay, I probably would get more out of it.
Go back and, you have
At some point,
all semester. Go back and reread it now. Because the reason I had you read the Fairy Story essay, this essay, and the translation is to see the impact all of this has on Tolkien's creation. What do we start next week? No, we start The Hobbit on Thursday, not Fellowship of the Ring. Okay.
No, we had the Hobbit. I completely forgot we had the Hobbit.
But you'll see a little bit of it in the Hobbit, but I think it'll really come to the fore when you're reading The Lord of the Rings. Especially this essay. What he says about the creation of the Beowulf essay, I think it gives you a window into Tolkien's own mind and the creation of The Lord of the Rings, and why he tells us story after story after story within the larger story of The Lord of the Rings. He's trying to do that same thing of create that sense of depth of time. Okay? All right, we'll stop there.
What is the translated language? Old English?
Old English, Anglo-Saxon.